So I'm crowding in and going first because Jing Xu has important things to say and have them. Anyway, I don't belong on this panel. The puzzling categorization of these. Perhaps my book, which Nikki didn't mention, Marriage and Mandatory Abortion Among the 17th Century Suraya, counts. That's not about the Chinese, it's about the Austronesians and the Surayan group in Taiwan. And nor is it based on fieldwork. So I'm not a family researcher. My first fieldwork focused on land tenure and Plains Aborigine history on the frontier. Like all of Arthur Wolf's students, I was introduced to my fieldwork in 75, 76 in Sancha by Wang Shiqing, who I want to acknowledge. It was a great help to me. He helped me find a place to live, and throughout my career remained a great help even after I left the field, and he became attached to Academia Sinica. I guess I should mention as background that I had been at IUP, the notoriously ungracious language. Language school in Taipei and 71, 72, and that afforded me in the summer to go visit Barb and Steve in Kaohsiung. So I had a little bit of taste of what it was like to be an anthropologist in Taiwan, but I went back in 75, 76 and was introduced to Sancha, and Emily Ahern helped me out by arranging for me to hire her own assistant, Liu Xiuyuan, as my field assistant. I think Rob ended up working with her brother. So there's an interesting set of connections there. So my fieldwork in 75, 76 was imagined as a study of landlord-tenant conflict, all Maoist ideas of class conflict. This is my image of reality at that point, but I hope to find out what the local historical background was in Taiwan to the ROC land reform. Reality, of course, turned out to be very different. I needed to know much more about the Japanese colonial state, which I knew nothing of, arrived. What I discovered was that, reclamation along the riverbanks and up in the hills with ponds and terracing were really the important contributors to landlordism such as existed in Sancha. And that led me to reject what I called the debt sale paradigm of landlordism in favor of a land development model in the context of population growth and intensification, as well as partable inheritance, an important aspect of Chinese family life that certainly affects class standing. And I wrote that then as an article called Rethinking Tenancy in Comparative Studies in Society and History. But also during my period doing fieldwork in Sancha, I spent a lot of time talking to old landlord families who had collections of land contracts, land that they had lost in the land reform, but land that they still considered their own, and these contracts were evidence of their title. And the way you establish titles is to have a whole series of contracts that go back to Adam and Eve, not quite, but in this case it was really these transactions involving Plains Aborigine groups who were required by the Qing government to sort of give some kind of acknowledgement to these land grants that incoming Chinese land developers laid claim. And so what I discovered from one of these contracts was that one of the parties to the contract, one of the Aboriginal groups, was still in the area. It was not in Sancha, but across the border in Taoyuan, sort of southeast of Taoyuan City, by the name of the Xiaoli Shi, and the prominent Xiao family, not only was living there, but had, done the work to create a printed genealogy. They had an elaborate ancestor tablet on their ancestral altar that honored the founding ancestor, with listing not Taiwan, not a place in the mainland as most Taiwanese ancestral tablets do, but a place in Taiwan as his ancestral home, and naming the apical ancestor Xiao Nayin in a distinctively non-Han given name. So discovering this and giving the sort of boring results I was getting from my interviews with tenants and trying to find out, what these horrible landlords had done to them, but never quite panned out. With the rural revolution or anything approaching that sort. I embarked on an historical anthropological study of the Taiwan frontier in the 17th and 18th centuries, in focusing on the relations between Chinese and the indigenous Austronesian Plains Aborigine groups. So I ended my fieldwork year in the Taiwan Provincial Library, combing through the magnificent Japanese private law studies and the other mounds of historical information that was available there. So inspired by Bill Skinner's City in Imperial China volume and Raymond Meyer's work on contracts, this resulted in my book, Statecraft and Political Economy on the Taiwan Frontier. Now, I will talk about family studies a little bit. First of all, when I was in graduate school, we were all given Morris Friedman's lineage books to read, told how great they were. But I later discovered that Morris Friedman in 1957 had published a book called Chinese Family and Marriage in Singapore, which is a much better book. And I wish I had read that rather than those stupid lineage books. Sorry, Steve, you're going to talk about lineage. And, given the shallow history of lineages in Taiwan and, their relatively weak appearance compared to those fabulous lineages in the Hong Kong New Territories, the Delta, lineages just never much appealed to me. So anyway, back to the family. Two earlier contributions based on Taiwan fieldwork that are the real landmarks of the field, I think, are Myron Cohen's House United, House Divided, published in 1976, and of course Marjorie Wolf's two books, 1968, House of Lim, and then later, Marriage in the Family in North Taiwan, 1972, I think it was. Arthur did a very masterful review of studies of the family in the Gates and Ahern volume that we saw previewed earlier. And of course, I shouldn't, talk about the history of these studies without mentioning Bernie Gallen's work on Shaoxing and Norma Diamond's work on fishermen in South Taiwan. I mean, they're all important contributions. The other thing, I've recently had a chance. Myron retired this year. In October, we had a nice retirement celebration at Columbia, which I was privileged to be invited to. And in reviewing his work, I was so struck, one, by the extreme empirical care and work that he had to do to develop that book, and the other by his immensely impressive study in one chapter of women's private money. And I think to the Sifeng, and to this day, I don't think that study has ever been properly replicated or even people have mentioned it, but no one has really looked at it in the detail that he did, where every nickel and dime was documented in what relative or friend or member of the village contributed how much and when to a young bride's private money. Fascinating study that that Myron should have done that so early, and it's really a completely original piece of work. The other thing I want to mention about family studies is, and something I've always admired about Arthur's work is his hypothesis testing methodology. I think he, whenever you would talk about this to me, it goes back, I think, to the psychologist at Cornell, William Lambert, who was one of the founders of the Six Cultures project that Jing knows much more about than I do at this point. But throughout Arthur's work on marriage and family, you get this constant, here's a possible hypothesis that explains this phenomenon, and then he goes on to test various versions of that with his data from the household registers, and then draws his conclusions. But it's always considering the alternative possibility and eliminating those alternatives that he finally arrives at what seems to be the most important answer. And that's something I try to mimic in my Soraya work and also in the foot binding book. And I've so there you have it. And of course, Arthur's studies on, starting in childhood socialization that Jing will discuss, but we're very much focused on family organization, but increasingly on the varieties of marriage, major, minor, nuxor, local, female and male adoption, all aimed at testing various possible incest theories and tests and refinements of the Westermarck hypothesis of that incest avoidance is a product of intimate childhood association, and explains the particularly low fertility of marriages between adopted little daughters-in-law and their matches, when they share, especially when they share their early childhoods together. And of course, household register studies is a big contribution, an exhausting contribution that Arthur has burdened us with. Is such a premier source of information about Chinese families, especially in the Japanese period. Taiwanese families, I should say, in the Japanese. And that's in part where my own work went with, the Population Society in Taiwan and the Netherlands research group, and the volume that Nikki mentioned that I edited on death at the extremes. Arthur, along with Zhuang Yingzhang and others, organized the historical demography project that computerized the household registers from 13 localities across Taiwan, and there have been more localities added since then, including some Aboriginal villages. I think there's more work to be done that we'll see ultimately come out of those household register studies. So enough, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, John. I remember when first time I met John in person was one of the AS meetings, and I just visited Hill in Northern California, up in the mountains, and then I never met Arthur Wolf, and I was asking John about his experience, and although I remember you told me clearly that the sort of scientific rigor Arthur had in, and perhaps due to his training in psychology, of hypothesis testing and of this very, very solid empirical data. I think that was, I just, when you were talking, I just remember that scene. And then now we're here, I have, it's really an incredible opportunity for me to be sitting here among all of you and share a little bit of reflections about what I learned from working on Arthur's incredibly precious and rare and rich field notes on childhood socialization in the village. Now everybody knows, called Xiaxizhou. I want to play a short, very short video clip, and it was something I found on YouTube. It was there were not many videos of Arthur Wolf on YouTube because it was YouTube was not very popular at the time, 20 decades ago. But in this, I think this was 2009. He was in Taipei in Academia Seneca. He was giving it was a religion. It's a conference seminar on religion. So here he started talking about his famous paper, God, Ghosts and Ancestors. And we also talk about the duplicate name. Anyway, he was trying to explain to the audience that why he didn't continue studying religion. He found religion, it was interesting, the folk religion. He talked a little bit about that. And then I think this is very important for me to understand his intention and where he came from. I think I'm glad that the several slides I prepared kind of echo with some of the themes we were talking about earlier today. I hope the audio is
a intellectual bent, perhaps because of background training in philosophy and psychology, but whatever is, the question I would really want to ask is, why are some people religious? What does this tell us about human nature? That is the question that, if I have seen a path to address that question, to bring somehow conclusive kind of data on it. If I even had a strong hypothesis, but I didn't. And that was part of the reason that I did continue. The other more important reasons I did see, or rather, thank goodness, another opportunity in which I could address that kind of question. And this is what I call minor marriages, the symbol of the Tongyangxi, etc. And I saw the possibility that you had a natural experiment in Taiwan in which you had two forms of marriage, one in which the couple didn't actually meet until the day of their marriage, which was more or less the case among certainly the older people in the first village I worked in, and the other form of marriage in which they were reared together from early childhood. And here was the question that the Finnish philosopher, sociologist, anthropologist, and Edward Westermarck had debated with Sigmund Freud. Lost the debate, but not because Freud had any very good evidence. And a question that was, certainly a very traditional question. A question that always lacked very strong evidence because you could never sort out. The only people who are typically reared together are brother and sister. And they're under the restrictions of the incest taboo. So if they avoid one another, you don't know whether it's because they've been reared together or because they're simply obeying the rule of the incest taboo. Here in Taiwan, you had a form of marriage in which the couple were reared together, and not only they were in more or less forced to marry. Many resisted it.
Okay, I think for the sake of time, I'm gonna just stop here. But it was for me, it's very important moment to know and to confirm my own understanding of his interests and where he came from. So So this particular intellectual bent is very important for me to understand, which is, and I also think is the enduring legacy of Arthur's works, which is the trying to understand human nature and how human nature relates to whatever we call culture or other terms anthropologists prefer to use these days, or nurture. Although in my understanding and training, these two are definitely not like dichotomous. They're always intertwined together. I think that's what Arthur wanted to do in his understanding too. So it's I think this is something that anthropologists unfortunately do not like to talk about, or some of them hate the word human nature. But for me, this is very natural. It's kind of, it resonates with my own interests too. So I want to talk a little bit about intellectual lineages and our personal inclinations in theory and the kind of question we want to talk about. So I was really kind of overwhelmed when I first take on this project. The huge amount of data, very systematic, and such a towering figure in my field. And you need to find an entry point to connect and become my own project. I think fortunately, because of the fact that I am not really kind of trained in any sort of orthodox mainstream American cultural anthropology, so I have a slightly different set of questions that interest me and motivated me, that somehow helped me take on this project and have a vision that is at least not opposite of what Arthur wanted to do. So there's some sort of affinity there. And I think I like the sort of question that have more of a universalistic implications from the get-go. And when I was studying, I first encountered anthropology when I was studying at Tsinghua in Beijing. And I was reading American anthropology, European anthropology works, and that time it was like the 2000s. And the thing got me really excited are the ones that have some sort of asking bigger questions, later got critiqued maybe. And I was particularly drawn to one line of research, mainly from European tradition, I don't know, French or British or the combination of both, that asks the question between human mind and human society, which is really, really not orthodox or mainstream in American anthropology. So by the time I came to graduate school, thanks to Clifford Geertz and all the other movements, the question that asks about human psychology and the implications on society is considered wrong, I don't know, or just ignored. It's really not fancy or trendy at all. But I was very fortunate to be working with a particular anthropologist who's really not trained in the American tradition. He was more of a European by training and by his origin, with Pascal Boyer. And I wanted to mention this interview because here I see the sort of similarity between how Pascal and his advisor, Jack Goody, think about things and how what kind of questions Arthur was asking. So in this interview, which I did for Chinese magazine to promote Pascal's book's Chinese edition, this was last year. It was the first time I came to understand my own intellectual lineage a little bit better. Before that, I never thought about that. And I asked him how he got interested in psychology, because he trained in philosophy, then did anthropology. He said, my advisor, Jack Goody, this is the original English transcript, was also an Africanist anthropologist. But he pursued big questions like, why are Euro-Asian family structures so different from those of Africa? And we have experts here like Pat who know that even though the answer is wrong, like about Chinese families, but the problem, the sort of vision to ask this question is very interesting. And then Pascal said, Jack Goody told me to address psychological questions. How do people represent their ghosts and spirits? How do they memorize long stories for 6 or 8 hours and reproduce them? How is that even possible? How do they acquire botanical knowledge? So on and so forth. You can clearly see this interest in the human mind. which in the American tradition has long, I don't know, declined. And then I asked him about the book, Religion Explained. That's the first time I asked, okay, why do you want to write a book about religion from an evolutionary cognitive perspective? And he said, I want to show that human cognition explains a lot of recurrent features of human culture. And this sort of, this conversation made me realize, okay, I heard some similar thing in Arthur's interview, because he was explaining to the audience who are studying religion, he was explaining why he chose another topic, because he wanted to find this sort of a question that he can ask about human nature, and then kinship and then minor marriage was the thing he thought he found an answer that can connect to human nature. Here, Pascal was saying that, religion, there are a lot of recurrent features despite the huge diversity and variations. And then this have to come from features of our human minds, our minds. So I just wanted to share this little bit of background information. My own interest is in the mind and the external world of the mind, which is unfortunately a very strange interest in today's anthropology, but cultural anthropology. On the other hand, evolutionary anthropologists are collaborating with psychologists, with cognitive scientists, with computer scientists, solving the major questions about human nature, about intelligence. You see the buzz of AI and all that, and about child development too, which is something I'm going to talk about. And this is the last slide. I will end very soon. So, and these years, thanks to taking on the Wolf project, I got interested in not only intellectual history, but also more concretely what triggered certain research and the findings. And Dominic, I share a similar interest. You were talking more about the political, social, historical context. And then in this project, I really got to see, very concretely how certain data came into being, and how maybe there's some aha moments in certain projects that lead the researcher either from the very beginning, the research design or the questions the researcher asks, or the very findings that we get to see in publications. So we get to see all these coherent arguments and sort of very well organized things in publications, but we don't get to see much of the backstage stories. So I'm going to share a little bit of the backstage stories. And Stephen Harrell, my friend, colleague, and mentor, I remember 2016 or something, he mentioned to me that there is this very precious archive of field notes that were about child development in a rural Taiwan society left behind by his advisor, Arthur Wolf. And of course, we all know about Arthur Wolf, his works on religion, on marriage and kinship, but I had no idea that this exists, the data on childhood and children. And he said I might be a suitable person to take on and to analyze these notes. And then 2018, I met Hill. I remember Hill she was greeting me at the airport, very small airport, Santa Rosa, and she called me Xu Jing, and a Taiwan accent of Mandarin immediately. And then we spent some time in the ranch, and I was absolutely overwhelmed when I saw the precious trove of data. I was almost brought to tears. I saw Arthur's work booths underneath the desk in the library. There's tons of books, and these data, they were in those typewritten cards, and that's in these sort of paper. Then we were scanning them out of dust and all that using my phone. Actually, there's an app of scanning on my phone, and that's how it all started. I'm so grateful, and this is a once in a lifetime opportunity for any anthropologists I can think of to have an opportunity to work on such precious and systematic notes. And then 2018, when I first visited the ranch, and then I met Hill's mom, Vera. I have such fond memory of her. I remember we were eating lunch in friend's house, and she was asking me, "Do you know my brother-in-law is he that famous? He said, I watched a videotape of maybe Arthur won a teaching award at Stanford. And Vera told me that watching the videotape, he was in the classroom. He was very engaged. He was walking back and forth. It's like an actor. And then she asked me, what are you interested in? She was 96 or yeah. And then I told her that I don't know because this is my first time seeing these notes, but I wanted to really study something fundamental about human nature or humanity, or like attachment and mother-child relationship. I remember Vera, she was like, yeah, there's power. There's sentiment. It's such a complex thing. I'm sure you will ace it. Then it was so encouraging because it just reveals to me that if we pursue these sort of seemingly, everybody knows it and we have all studied it, seemingly ordinary questions of human relationships and emotions and all that, and morality, it is so common, it occurs everywhere, but then it has a profound implication, maybe value to even ordinary people like Vera, who's not trained an anthropologist in any fashion. So there's that. And also at the time, there's a lot of discussion about debates between anthropologists and psychologists. It is universal, but it's also very diverse. So that sort of thing, I think that was the kind of things I was interested in. But in the process of actually working on the notes, because the notes so far focus more on children's interactions, so there aren't many about, sort of attachment per se, but that's something I would love to pursue in the future a bit more. And I want to tell two other, speaking of attachment, that as Arthur spoke in the lecture, he said the minor marriage, and a crucial factor is that those two, the brother and sister, they have to live together. And that sort of emotional, whatever experience you call, and that is a crucial intermediate variable that leads to the sort of incest avoidance later, right? It has to be the little girls were brought in from very early on. I think sometimes definitely it's in infancy or toddlerhood. And this is universal human attachment in a way. And what's more, he's a brilliant finding, inspired psychologists who do experiments. There is a group of psychologists at UC Santa Barbara. They, based on empirical research, like the Simple in Taiwan and other places, not many cases in the diversity of human culture, they did hypothesis testing and did a lot of experiments on the human kinship index. One of the important things is the co-residence of brother and sister. And that paper got published in Nature of Science. So it inspired a lot of follow-up research to do very rigorous scientific studies. I think that is such a brilliant example in anthropology, that anthropology and ethnographers can contribute. And another small story I want to mention is Marjorie Wolf was also a big part in the collection of these original field notes from 1958 to 1960. At some point, I was just plowing through the notes back and forth, and they just revealed to me that maybe the reason she had this brilliant concept, uterine family, I think there's some precedent in some other anthropologists, but what empirical evidence that might have triggered her might be what she saw in these notes or overheard. She didn't speak Taiwanese, she spoke Mandarin, but they have interpreters and assistants. But what she saw, maybe in her landlord's household or other households in the village, that mother will secretly tell the boy, that's what I found in the notes, to scold their father, to talk bad about their father. Your father have a mistress and this and that. And this boy was very, very agitated. He was about to do something about that stupid father. And you can see the emotion and the sort of sentiments brewing. And then recently when I started some follow-up work on the general notes, that is one type of notes that I haven't yet analyzed, because I assume that Arthur and Margwell, they have written so much about the general notes. It's under the, anyway, it's long story short, under 6 cultural studies paradigm, they have one category called general notes. That's observation interviews about the village at that time, right? You do a village ethnography, you have to know everything about the village. And then in this general notes, I was just reading it last night because it was just freshly proofread by some student assistant here, and this mother was saying that the children always understand when the parents do something wrong. It's about she was talking about her own experience, this mother, that her husband came home drunk or something and beat her up, and her son was very, very angry. Her son was about to just hit the father. So I was like, I mean, it's such a pity that I can never go back to that original field site, or I don't have first-person fieldwork experience. But what might have triggered such important findings and concepts and whatnot might be just these little experiences and stories and what you experience, sometimes unexpectedly, in the field. And that is part of the charm and beauty of ethnography. And I want to just say one more thing, that uterine family and minor marriage, for both of these important concepts and findings, which have enduring value for understanding even today's society, childhood is a very key aspect in these formulations, yet they don't get to be the focus. So my work is, in a way, trying to bring these children into the spotlight, and I will talk about that in the book talk. So thank you.
Now to the kind of the floor to reminisce, talk about your own experiences of family and kinship, or to direct any questions to our candidates.
A very short addendum is the reason that I told you about this archive is because Hill had written to me, and I spoke to some other people at the same time, and I didn't know, and said, "Do you know anybody who might do something with Arthur's Field Archive?" And Jing had come to the UW in 2014, that's right, and I knew that she was working in the psychology department study on cognition and moral ideas in 9 and 10-month-old babies, American babies. And so when Hill asked me, right away, that's the person I thought of. So that's it came as an inquiry from her, and wasn't my idea to start with. Although I had always wondered about what the hell was going to happen to all this stuff. Yeah.
Comment on hypotheses. So, John, thank you. When I first showed up in Taiwan in 1976, lost and confused and hot, John was like super helpful. John had overlapped with me at Stanford. So in the genealogy of us, he's the older brother, Uncle Steve, Auntie Hill, Grandpa Arthur, miscellaneous ancestor David. Another Emily, of course. But John was super helpful. But when that year at Stanford, when John lived across the street from me, and I was writing proposals for this dissertation fieldwork, and I was afraid to show it to Arthur, so I showed it to John instead. And John said, "Well, Arthur will like it a lot better if you have hypotheses." And either he hadn't taught this thing to Emily, or Emily hadn't thought it was important enough to pass down to her students. But that was news to me. And I did it because I was scared of Arthur. But in fact, I was really grateful. And there's not, although I don't think you can tell by reading the stuff that gets published, there's not a single project that I've done that I haven't tried to think about in those terms, even though it was that first time in particular was a struggle to think about it that way, but super, super useful. So thank you twice for that. And then I did show it to Arthur. He was okay with it, but he said, "You know, you really shouldn't work on religion." So not so different from that clip. You really shouldn't work on religion. it's too complicated, it's too hard. Do that late in your career when you're more mature. You know, you're not ready for religion. And maybe it was because he couldn't see a way to reduce it to hypotheses very easily. I'm not really sure what he meant. Obviously, I ignored his advice, or that bit of his advice. But anyway, hypotheses, yes.
What you learn from hypotheses is the falsification.
Exactly. You learn to consider alternate explanations so that you're not starting with your conclusion, and then of course you conclude your conclusion.
We've been sort of talking about Taiwan studies and now family and kinship. But is it really so separate from the people who are working on Hong Kong? I was thinking of how I was involved with a conference on family and kinship, and then marriage and family, and then you did the one on age of marriage. Jack Goody is involved, Skinner is involved, but both Watsons are involved who've done their work in Hong Kong. Do you really see these as totally separate bodies, or do you need to consider what's being done in Hong Kong as
Oh, certainly. But they are a very different context, and you know the lineage looms so much larger in the stories that are told about the Canton Delta, and even in the architecture in Taiwan, it's all temples. And you go to these places in the Delta, and it's all lineage halls. So it's
So you think maybe historians were more attracted to that because lineage development was important to much of South China?
oh, certainly that's important. I mean, well, but they have to deal with what's on the ground. And that's what they find. The anthropologists.
Right, but I guess what I'm really sort of asking, maybe Steve would be a good person for this, is it such a separate body of knowledge?
No, I'm gonna talk a little bit more about that tomorrow, but I will say the answer right now, no.
Mhm.
And I'll elaborate tomorrow morning or tomorrow night.
And I think I can add to that as well, because we don't have Myron Cohen here. And if you read Cohen's chapter, right, he actually used a very specific term saying that this is the Hong Kong, dash Taiwan era of Chinese anthropology.
Right, and they're reading each other's work and
That's right.
responding to each
Yeah,
other's
a
work.
lot of fertilization across different field sites in Hong Kong, Taiwan, and Maurice Freeman's field with sensitization.
Mhm.
So,
And Myron took it to China.
Sure.
He did it with Kobe and Shanghai and then Meishan. So
I could say that in my own training back in China, reading about 汉人社会 is all part of the repertoire. Watson, and for me personally, when I was rereading Wolf's research, I wrote a chapter with historians on childhood. Barbara Ward in Hong Kong, British anthropologist, she wrote stuff about socialization and all that. So it's, for me, when I started out, there is the 华南研究. So my master's thesis was actually looking at ethnic minority in Hunan through history, late imperial and all that, looking at 地方志 and Zupu and all that. And for that group of scholars, pretty much fused together the concept of Huanan, and in late imperial, it's sort of cross-fertilization between historians and the anthropologists who started out from the Maurice Freeman lineage and then seeing how state and local society interacted and people have their agency to create and all that. When I started, that was what we all read together, including Arthur.
Issues like family and property.
Right.
Crossing both sides.
Right.
I have, another point to add to that is that, are these like family structures or marriage patterns, property or even religious practices like on Taiwan, right? I think the ways in which, again, this has to do with the framework we see things. So we sort of see these things as, of course, one way or the other, these are synodics, Chinese-speaking communities, and, have a lot of these connections. But again, like if you look at it from my perspective, in which I will, of course, I would market myself as a Taiwan specialist, a China specialist. But the Taiwan part of that is that, during the same time on Taiwan, when these communities were being examined by Wolf, by everyone else, we do have different like family patterns. I would say that, for example, the mainland families, which are extremely, I mean, they all came from China, but because they're refugees, they're extremely different. And it's all nuclear. And in terms of religion, a huge number of them actually converted to, Christianity, different sort of forms of Christianity. Now, I mean, without doubt, at the time, they saw themselves as a former Chinese families. But these are, you might call them non-traditional, which is not an interest of students, right? The reason why I raised up those points is, if you ask me that, what's the difference between that particular framework at that time and some of these like newer Taiwan studies scholarship, I will say that that's definitely a difference. Right? It's in order when you sort of switch to that sort of Taiwan studies framework, and the way in which I promote Taiwan studies, it's not like you just see yeah, of course, it's what's important on this island, but they do have connections someplace else, right? Allow me to ask one question. I really want to ask the anthropologists this question because, especially with author and students, because you guys actually did have a lot of these documents and sort of the household register, information from the Japanese colonial period, and then you're looking at these communities actually that's actually in front of you right here. How do you So this is a methodological question. How do you basically sort of, in actual practice, for example, when you look at, for example, religion or family structure, or if you're trying to talk about these kind of marriage, how do you actually sort of, from what I'm trying to ask is that to look at the data, the sort of data left by the Japanese, and then do the observation yourself. What do you start with? Do you start with the observation on the ground first, and you go back to the data, or you look at the historical data first and then decide the kind of research? You see, I know this is a very it seems like a very, very detailed question, but this is the kind of question, I mean, Pat will understand. We historians are very, just frivolous about, I think that's the wrong word. But, we are very sort of picky about these kind of methodological questions, right? Because we're trained to be pretty empirically minded. So I don't know. Anything on that? I mean, if you don't want to answer it, totally.
John should answer
Well,
that.
I think it starts with lesson learned, as it did for us. I mean, spend all this time looking at children and learning about, Shashijo, and then discovered that, oh my God, there were these Japanese registers,
I see.
that we can make sense of. But, I'm sure, then things are going swimmingly in the registers, and then you hit something. What's going on here? Can't figure this out. Well, then you go back to your local informants and you start digging around, and hopefully you come to some resolution. But I think it has to be a back and forth kind of process.
Back and forth, relationship. Yeah, I like that a lot. And I think, for historians, historians are mostly not just, we with our department with Halloween, we have this big salad and said, we study dead people. That's our department. So we usually don't get to talk to people who are living. Depending on period, but there are, like, for my topic, there's an opportunity to do that, right? And when we do that, I don't know what students are trained here at UW, but I guess at UBC we're still pretty empirical. And everything started in the archives, right? But then mostly stay in the archives. And basically, you just try to compare. We do this dialectic thing, but I think it's just basically mainly compare what people think right now, which is usually not true, and then what the truth actually lies in the archive. But I kind of see that the ways in the anthropologists do things might have a lot of it is really instructive to historians. Maybe we should sort of rethink Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, I think I have to follow up on John's point. I think as far as I know, for this particular, like the Arthur's research, he started out at looking at children, and as his dissertation research, he has a very elaborate proposal and all that, and had very elaborate methods, and he collected so much data. But it's in the process of living in that village and collecting these data, and he maybe overheard like women's conversations about they were not happy with marriage. I don't know about the details because Arthur didn't leave any diary or that sort of field notes. And he also had a very important local informant. One of the key informant was Mr. Wang Shijing's mom, right? It's an old lady who lived in the village. She's from Zhangzhou, so she's kind of I don't know how to say that in Minnan. She's she's not. Yeah, she remarried into this village, but she knows everything. So I think Arthur at the time in the field talked to her a lot, and her son, who's a prominent Taiwan historian, who they grew up in that area, and then discovered the registers, and then applied for funding, and then come together to have larger scale surveyed about these data. And I want to add another point, that is as Rob and other people have mentioned, the theoretical thinking, right? That also informed the kind of questions he was asking. He was interested in the Westermarck and Freud debate. So there's always, for anthropologists, I'm sure for historians too, we're all, I don't know, informed, enlightened, but also imprisoned by the sort of theoretical framework we were trained in. And I want to add one more thing. Marjorie Wolf, I remember she had that is also a very important reference for me. She wrote a chapter on the 1990 volume called Field Notes. This is the anthropologist. It's quite influential at the time. They were debating, reflecting on the authority of an ethnographer and all that. She wrote about her Taiwan fieldwork and later the China fieldwork about women too. But she said she had all her diaries and the notes and all that. But then at that time, the Orthodox anthropologists were all interested in the vertical, the lineage, the relations. And she said she felt like women played an important role, but then she thought she was wrong because all these great theories from Morris Friedman and all that, they were not talking about women's role. And she says only later when she was exposed to feminist theories, then she began to make sense of these old field notes. Then she went back to those notes and to reinterpret, and then had Women and Family in Rural Taiwan, that book. So that's a chapter it's not my words. She said those in the chapter. Yeah.
I just am thinking of some, sorry, cut all of you off, but not really. Anyway, two things from, stories that Arthur told me or told all of us. One, some of the data is contemporary to when Arthur was in the field, the adultery survey. So I don't know if you know what that is, but he went around and, talked about, divorce and these high rates of adultery in American society, and then asked these old men in the village, does anything like that happen around here? And out came the stories. So, and then he went back to the household registers and found these marriages and correlated them with the ones that were with little daughters-in-law and the ones that were major marriages, and found a relationship. Adultery is higher in the little daughter-in-law kinds of marriages. So, some of the information, it goes on, of course, beyond those marriages existed into the period that Arthur was living. So the other just little note, sorry, is when he was doing the childhood studies, I remember I can't remember whether it was a tap or maybe one of these play things where they have the children under observation. Yeah. And it was an adopted daughter. And there was some situation where she just broke down in tears, to this sort of play example of, maybe a mother punishing a child or something. And, it's just, I think it really got to Arthur that, this is, such a traumatic experience that some of the young girls are going through. Yeah.
I'm going to be a little more personal than usual here, but I want to particularly thank you for honoring my mother. And she is a very interesting example of the problems of fragile attachment. She was born to a family that had recently immigrated to Canada. They already had a bunch of children. This little girl, the family just couldn't, so they gave her to an orphanage, and they were beaten and not fed very well and everything. So, but after a short time, she was adopted by somebody else. But she never felt attachment for foster parents, and she had this extreme unhappiness about having been abandoned. I have seen what I think a Simpua would go through in my mother. And to cap it off, to get yet more personal, I was born when she was 20. I was a breech birth. It was extremely painful, ripped her all up. And then the hospital, good old-fashioned hospital, wouldn't let her see me for 2 weeks. And there is an advantage to bonding earlier. I mean, so I can really understand a lot of what Arthur understood about Simpua. And we have Arthur's ghost among us today, and I'm very happy for that. His stuff, this large segment of the material, of course, Jing has done wonderful work with. There's a lot of other stuff. And when he died, we had an agreement that we would be very happy to host graduate students who were writing a dissertation or something, or just to come as they pass through and see if there's anything in the archive that they would be interested in. So you may think about that and pass it on to your friends and your students. Wolf Ranch is a nice place to stay, except it's half an hour from any store or neighbor. It's really remote. There are coyotes.
Pigs still.
There are pigs, and the pigs will eat you if you're lost in the forest. So it takes some guts to stay up there. But it was one of his dearest wishes.
Thank you, Gil, for sharing that.
Yeah, I wanted to come back to Dominic's question because I think you're addressing 2 different contrasts. One is between history and anthropology, but one is between historiography and ethnography. And they're not the same thing. They're temperamentally different, I think. I think, the historiographers, I've known so many historians, I finally got into the archives, and then they disappear, and then 6 months later, they're all covered with dust, and they've got this big stack of documents, and they're just all excited. I couldn't do that for 2 days, But I think that my intellectual temperament is much closer to the historian. I like to tell stories. And my most recent book, which has nothing to do with Taiwan, Ecological History of Modern China, right?
Which you should all read.
What?
Which you should all read.
It's just too long. It's even longer than the family book. But I can finally write history because I get all the documents I need on the internet, right? It's not worth going into the archives. But I think that, temperamentally, it's more about storytelling than it is about hypothesis testing. And that's what makes it history. And anthropology, and this is what's really interesting about Jing's work, because it's hybrid in a really interesting way. It's using fieldwork experience as mediated first by Ms. Chun and Ms. Yen, and then by Marjorie Wolf and Arthur Wolf, and in some cases Huang Jiashan, and using that as the document of which is historiographical, but the method, I mean, the intellectual questions are anthropological. So you get this, crossover between somebody like Jing, who's right now doing, or just has finished doing, and she should have it. You can have it tomorrow.
The book?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's
Probably in the
coming
mail.
on Amazon to my house tonight. The official publication.
But
Yeah, it's not done. I am still
yeah,
writing some articles and we do,
Yeah.
there's so much
doing anthropology historiographically, and somebody, who might be doing history ethnographically, like you're doing with your oral history, or you're doing with the oral history of us, but also your oral history of the immigrants.
Rob, you had the last one.
Yeah, I did. So I wanted to get back to partly Pat's original question about Hong Kong, or just how does this relate to Chinese kinship in other parts of the sinological world? But also reflecting when Steve told us about his dissertation, which is about variation in belief, right, within one very small vocabulary. I have read your dissertation. I might be the only one besides you. I'm the only.
She read the ecological history book.
Okay, anyway, but it's about kinship, and what are the boundaries of what we call Chinese kinship? And Steve had made that comment early today too about going to a funeral in Yunnan or whatever you said,
Yeah.
and you recognize, right? It doesn't look like it's from the moon. The way if you went to Cameroon or someplace, it might look like it was from the moon. So that's what I want to think about, but just within Sanxia, and returning back to families and kinship, this is where my advisor worked, right? She wrote that book about this place with 4 really tightly organized, compact, kind of clearly bounded lineages. So that if you had to burn incense for an ancestor who wasn't patrilineal, it had to be in some dusty corner of a back room, someplace it could never be in the lineage hall, right? Really strictly patrilineal. So the place I was, but I don't know how far away it was from there, but 2 miles. I mean, it was long walk, but it was certainly bike rideable and long walk. There was no lineage hall. There was nothing you'd call a lineage. Every ancestor, I believe every ancestral altar had at least 2 different surnames on it. Some of them had 4, one of them had 5 different surnames. That is, if you parachuted in there and didn't know you were in a Chinese place or a Taiwanese place, you would not call it patrilineal.
I had one family that had 4 generations of entirely matrilineal ancestors.
So I'm totally not surprised by that. But it's just to say, so now we're talking about a radius, a circle with a diameter of a mile or 2. That's it. That's the range of variation, all legitimately, we can explain why you would get these different patterns, but all legitimately within the range of what we're going to count as Taiwanese, if that's what we're trying to count, or Chinese, if that's what we're trying to count, that is, it would pass it looks familiar test. And yet it's really very different. It's not so much a question of, is it the same or not the same? Is my, Gyugongpyo was not even a village, sub-village that I was in, does it count as the same kinship system as super patrilineal, where Emily was, or does it not? So it's partly what we want to count. And I think that relates to the question of where's the line between Taiwan and Hong Kong and China, as well as, what counts as Chinese kinship.
Thank you for that, Rob. Yeah. Comments followed by questions that brings together several threads in discussing the evolution of anthropology, the rise of Taiwan studies. When I was an undergraduate, the very first work that I read in Taiwan studies, as we think about today, is Millis Brown's book, Steve's student. And I feel like that came at a kind of transitionary period
with this kind of style of family kinship scholarship. When you read the book, it's very much, the empirical evidence is very much focused on extra-local, the kinds of marriage patterns and other kinds of kinship relations of traditional Taiwanese society. But the introduction is very postmodern in terms of bringing in identity. And for me, that's where we see the transformation from our argument that this is no longer just Chinese society, but how people think about themselves in relationship to faith finding and bringing in postmodern kind of identity to that. That's where it shifts to Taiwan studies. And I don't know what all of you think about that. If you have any thoughts about that, that I think it was published 2004. Is that right, Steve? Or
Which one?
Melissa Brown's Chinese.
Yeah, sometime around.
Yeah, there was that moment in anthropology. If my conception of that is kind of one of the early time studies works where identity is brought in, and unlike other fields, identity I think is much more central to time studies than it is to say Chinese studies, and continues to be, even though anthropology I think is left behind identity in other area studies fields. So I don't know about it.
I mean, I'll say something. I think Melissa's book, I mean, obviously extremely popular in the Taiwan Studies Circle, Taiwan Center. People who take on the Taiwan Center paradigm because, yeah, basically what she's saying is that Taiwan is not Chinese because it has all of, I think really, again, and so I sort of want to like respond to you and then what Peter says altogether is that I think, if you, I mean, we love to talk about like historicizing things and anthropology, and of course, we historians, we always historicize, right? And, I think that the questions of, whether or not these are Taiwanese or Chinese or these, because you have all these similarities, all these societies. I mean, of course, right? Nation state identities, they always, like in this context, always come later, right? The idea of the Taiwanese state, I mean, that's a very, very recent phenomenon. And if you look at the Chinese state itself, modern China, Republic of China, that's also quite recent if you want to look at the entire history of that culture, right? So if you want to understand things culturally, right, that how China as a civilization or as a world was actually organized. I mean, they're under a very different kind of cosmic worldview. Human relations with one another, with nature, and also with the state itself. So then if that's the understanding, I don't think these are, I don't even see a question there. I mean, is Taiwan Chinese? Of course. Not in the sense that, that if you put all of these things in, but it is also at the same time Chinese. You can say that because of those kind of things we're talking. But so what is the point? The point is, I guess for me, is having this historicized understanding and be very precise about what you're talking about. I guess for me, that's okay. Yeah.
Should we conclude this panel now with a nice big one?
One short,
Absolutely, yeah.
I want you to all think tonight about the elephant in the room. Do you know what that might be? China? No, you, us. The fighting for position, jobs, grants is as much a part of this story as anything else. And it's awkward to talk about, especially the fighting between the movement toward the linguistic turn, the cultural turn. Melissa Brown's book is an excellent example of something where she used Arthur Wolf's hope in thinking about the household registers, but she also had to satisfy the people who wanted to do the textual stuff. And, a graduate student, you do what you're told. And if you're told two things, I guess you do two things. it was a very difficult period for graduate students.